Hi everyone, can you hear me? Okay. Welcome to day number 2. I just wanted to remind you that if you do have any questions that you would like us to raise on Friday's panel discussion, then please feel free to email them to me. This is my email address here. And today's speaker is Professor Chinsamy-Turan, who is from the UCT Department of Biological Sciences. And her research focuses on the microscopic structure of vertebrate teeth, so both in living vertebrates and vertebrates already extinct. And she's really an internationally renowned scholar, and she's won numerous prizes at many levels, at both national level in South Africa and abroad. And she's also a prolific author, having published books both for popular audiences and at an academic level. So her most recent popular book is called Fossils for Africa, and this was published 2 years ago in 2014. Today she'll be telling us about science's role in providing evidence for life on the Earth. So I leave it to you, Vanessa.
Okay, thank you. Okay, hi everyone. So today we're going to talk about life on Earth, a scientific explanation. And I said I'm going to do 45 minutes, a 45-minute lecture on this phenomenal topic. And I am sure I will just scratch the surface of all that we need to talk about. But to start off, I want to say that I want you all to be comfortable about talking about life on Earth. And I know that many of you come from particular religious groups, and I want to say, in no way do you need to feel threatened by this. And often people think, oh, but you know, it'll be contrary to my personal religion, and I don't want to know about evolution. But I want to make you all comfortable and make you realize that there are many different religions, and for as long as people could think about the world, there are views about how the world was created and how people came to be. So as many different religions, there are many different worldviews about creation. So there's not just one view. But the most important thing is that religion is a belief system. You grow up, you believe in it. You don't have to question why. You just say, basically, God created it, and that's the way it is. You don't have to question how things change. When we look at science, of course, we actually want to understand how life changed over time. So we try to understand what is the scientific explanation for life on Earth. And is there this idea, or what can we say about how life changed over time? And we know that this particular topic is dealt with under evolution. And evolution is the scientific explanation for life on Earth. Most of you know that Charles Darwin was the first person who proposed this idea about how life changes. He proposed the mechanism for how life changed. And what we also know, and I'm sure some of you know this already, that Charles Darwin had undertaken a 5-year voyage as a very young person. He was just 22 years old, 5-year voyage around the world, and he traveled to all these various places, and en route he basically studied the biota that he came across, and he also had a very passionate interest in geology. So wherever he went, he looked at the plants, he looked at the animals, he looked at the geology, and he basically, this voyage, 5-year trip, seeded his ideas about evolution. But it took him 22 years before he actually published these theses on the origin of species. And we know that in 1859, he proposed this concept of biological evolution as a theory of descent with modification through variation and natural selection. And through this understanding, he suggested that all life forms on Earth are the result of modification of pre-existing forms. So if we accept evolution, we know that the central idea of biological evolution is that all life shares a common ancestor. And, as Darwin explained, through a process of descent with modification, we lead to the diversity of life on Earth. So, given that, we know that life has history, and we also know from the fossil record that life changed over time. We also know that different species will share common ancestors. And Darwin's mechanism for evolution was natural selection. So he proposed, he was able to observe that life changed over time, and he was the first person to propose this mechanism of natural selection to explain how life changed over time. And we often hear people say, evolution is not real, evolution is just a theory. And yesterday we had Jeff Murugan tell us about what a theory is and about a scientific, rational thinking about the world around us. And so we know that evolution is not just a theory. In fact, it is a theory. And we know that in science, a theory is an explanation for a natural phenomena that is well substantiated by evidence. That is the basis of when a scientist says they have a theory. It is not just guesswork, it's not just thumbsuck. A theory actually is something that has been observed, but the explanation for that observation is what we refer to as a theory. So in every sense of the scientific word, the evolution is a theory. And we know that, as yesterday Jeff explained, we know that scientists begin by making an observation. You basically look around, observe the natural phenomena, whether you're looking at space or whether you're looking at a microorganism or whether you're looking at the fossil record or just the diversity of life around us. It begins by observation. Once you make the observation, you come up with a hypothesis. The hypothesis is an idea about what, or for an explanation about your observation. That hypothesis is tested by experiment, tested by further observation, and it can be supported or it can be falsified. So a hypothesis is where the testing occurs. If it's falsified, you don't have a theory. The hypothesis was nullified. If the hypothesis is supported by the evidence that is able to be observed, you then get a theory. So evolution is a theory because it is supported by the evidence that is available. So we see that in science, only the best supported hypotheses are referred to as a theory. And that is very important. Yesterday, also, Jeff explained how we come to this idea about the scientific methodology. And the essence of the way in which Darwin approached the study of evolution was very, very much a scientific methodology. We also heard yesterday from Jeff how ideas in science develop. And we know this very famous quote by Isaac Newton, who said, "If I have seen further than others, it is by standing upon the shoulders of giants." And we know that in science, all development in science really grows upon what was done before. And if we look at this historical context of Darwin's life and his ideas, we know he was born in 1809, and he died, of course, in 1882. But Darwin published his work on the origin of species in 1859. So there were lots of other people who were thinking about science, who were writing about science during this time. And Darwin was then able to utilize the existing information that was around to try and actually put his ideas within the context of what already was known. So by the time Darwin actually began writing about his work, we know that Hutton was a geologist. He already proposed his theory of gradualism, which that if you think about the way in which mountains form or the way earthquakes happened, if they happen today, the same way in which they happened could have happened in the past again. So mountain building, for example, a volcano erupting, it's this idea of uniformitarianism. We know that Thomas Malthus had published his essay on the principles of population, and that the resources in the world are limited, and that only if populations continuously grow, we will really exploit the current resources. And that was done in 1798. I mean, today, those of you that came to the lecture earlier, we had this interesting conversation at 9:15 in the 9:15 lecture about exactly this topic. We know Lamarck had published his ideas about evolution. We know Lyell, again, as a geologist. And all these had come even before Darwin himself. So by the time Darwin actually began thinking about evolution, it was already accepted that the Earth was in the range of millions of years. Because as geologists, we understand that the way in which the rocks forms, the way in which the mountains have formed, had to have taken millions of years for Earth's landscape to form. By this time, people already had begun to find fossils, so we knew that there was an existence of a fossil record. George Cuvier had already proposed that there were pre-existing life forms. And so Darwin came into this knowing that there was already organisms from distant time preserved within the rocks. And already a variety of biologists or natural historians already noted that there were many similarities among species. And of course, because of Cuvier's work, people realized that there was this idea that modern animals are descended from organisms that lived in the past. And when Darwin was traveling around the world, he came across many examples where he found living biota that were very similar to ones that he found within the rocks. And he made also these connections between the living world and the extinct world as well. So by the 19th century, questions were being asked about what natural mechanism could explain why organisms change. So the observation was made, but the explanation was still needed. How do these organisms change? And of course, the other explanation that needed answering was what hereditary mechanism could enable organisms to change? So we can see these changes, but what causes them to change? And so we all know that Darwin had proposed this idea of natural selection, that is the mechanism that allows organisms to change. And only much later do we know that DNA, the genetic components within every living thing, is what the hereditary mechanism is. So Darwin didn't know about this, but he proposed this idea of natural selection being the mechanism for evolutionary change. And even when DNA was subsequently identified, Darwin's hypothesis still held true. And we also know that today this question is also answered. Oops. So when Darwin formulated his hypothesis, he had this knowledge that was already available at the time from other scientists. Through his trip around the world, he realized there was this incredible diversity of life. And also, he was able to look at places he visited, what the fauna and flora of those places, how they compared with other places. So he was able to also look at adaptations of organisms to particular environments. And along his journey, he looked at fossils and extant forms. So for example, in Argentina, he looked at the glyptodons within the fossil record, and he realized that they were just big, giant, pre-existing forms of armadillos. And several other examples he also looked at. He traveled around to Galapagos Islands, where he studied the finches and other birds that were around, and he was able to see how well these organisms were adapted for that particular environment. And through his journey, he also found that widely distributed species often differ in different regions. And of course, being an amateur geologist, he was also very interested in rock formations, and he also firsthand experienced an earthquake. So Darwin's approach was definitely scientific. He began with the journey, which was really, he didn't set out on a mission to explain how life changed. He basically went on the journey, something exciting to do, a young man with time on his hands. So he didn't really say, I'm going to develop something. But because he was a scientist at heart, he made the observations. And his observations were fact-finding, okay? Looking at what he saw, making observations, and then coming up with this hypothesis of how these organisms could change. And then he made the hypothesis of evolution, and then he had to test the hypothesis. And I told you, Darwin took 22 years before he published his ideas. And in those 22 years, he thought about exactly different ways in which his hypothesis could be tested. Because he had actually studied religion, and he knew that Victorian society would really oppose this idea about evolution. And he thought he has to have a really strong case that would be able to be tested. And if it's falsified, well, that's the nature of science. But if he's going to make a hypothesis, and if he's going to propose a theory, it must be well supported. And he basically thought about the many, many different ways in which the hypothesis could be tested. And by the time he published the theory, it was very, very rigorous. And we know today that after 150 years, Darwin's hypothesis has still not been falsified. It's still tested, has stood the test of time. So if we think about evolution, and we think, so if evolution is true, then it means that the age of the Earth should be old. There should be fossil evidence to show us that there are changes in the fauna over time, and we should be able to see the development from simple to complex life forms. If evolution is true, we should also see that there are changes in the morphology, but that morphology, physiology, biochemistry, and genetics of any organism should also reflect the evolutionary relationships. And so we would say that closely related organisms should share similarities in these various characteristics. If evolution is true, the fossil record should show us intermediate forms. And we should also see species should change as conditions change. So we need to be able to look and see, do organisms really adapt when conditions change? And then can we say that if we look at the fossil record, do we actually see how species change from one form to another? So these are ways in which, and there are others as well. I've just given you 6 examples here, but there are other ways in which one can test this hypothesis of evolution. And if we look at the age of the Earth, we saw yesterday, I slipped in a slide of the spiral galaxy because we live on a spiral galaxy. And I thought that yesterday, Jeff, and of course because Vanessa is here and she's an astronomer as well. And I thought, if we think about where we live, we know that we live on the outer fringes of a spiral galaxy such as this one, which began, as Jeff had said yesterday, 13.7 billion years ago. If we look at our Earth, we know that the oldest rocks on Earth date to about 3.5 billion years. And within South Africa, we have some of the world's oldest rock formations. And the Barberton Greenstone Belt, just in that area there, we see that we have some of the rocks. And in fact, people, I brought a little piece of rock for you. So you can all feel very young when you hold this, because this is a little piece of this rock that comes from the Barberton area. It's called from the Barberton Greenstone Belt, and it's a little beautiful piece of a rock that is 3.5 billion years old. So it's one of the oldest rock formations in the world. And in 2004, in the science journal, the academic journal called Science, Martin de Wit and his team published these microbially formed structures. Can I just get this pointer? Yeah, these fine little structures where the margins contain carbon. And they've proposed that the carbon actually is biogenetic in origin. So it's basically formed by organisms. If we think about the fossil record, we know that the fossil record tells us when organisms originated. Through the fossil record, we can understand how they diversified, and we can also understand when organisms became extinct. So in those Barberton Greenstone Belt shale, we know that we have traces of organic life. We don't actually have the actual organisms. But there are examples in the fossil record of these filamentous bacteria. Okay, so they are the simple filamentous cyanobacteria that are found within the rocks. We have examples of stromatolites, where the bacteria then form aggregates or colonies. And in the fossil record, we have many examples of this. And I have a core here of one of these very ancient stromatolites that are about 2 million years old. And if you look at this closely, we know that in the living rock pools, that they have fairly restricted distributions. We find them mainly in Australia. Hamelin Pool is one place where you find modern stromatolites. Shark Bay is another place. So very limited distribution. But we know that they form in these colonies, and we know that they form in layers. And if you look at this rock that I'm going to send to you, you can very clearly see the layers. And each of these layers actually indicate one time when these cyanobacteria were alive. So today we can still find them, but in the fossil record, they were present as well. So those were simple aggregates of single cells. But what about complex life forms? So in the world, there's only this one locality that dates to 2.1 billion years, and it's in Gabon, very recently discovered, only in 2010, where there are these very unusual complex structures that have been found. We don't really know exactly what they are, but they certainly suggest complexity. And we certainly can see some kind of internal development. So this is the actual fossil, and using micro-CT, they've actually been able to look inside. But we don't really know what they are.
How big are they?
They're quite small. Oops, is there a scale bar on there? No, they're quite small, so we're looking at a few millimeters, so small structures. We know that there are many other places in the world where we have beginnings of multi-cellular structures. And multicellular life is abundant by 575 million years. There are many localities in the world where you can find these Ediacaran fauna. And again, they are impressions because, you know, the fossil record tends to be limited to hard parts of organisms, but sometimes you can find soft tissue impressions. And what we have here from the Ediacaran fauna are impressions of what this life was like. So we don't know that they looked like this, but they seem to suggest that this is perhaps how they actually were when they were alive. But one of the fascinating things that happens in the fossil record is that by about 545 million years ago, we see this explosion of diversity. Every single phyla that we have today is represented in the fossil record 500 million years ago. So by this time, we see that you have invertebrates. So basically, these organisms, shelled organisms, I have an example here of one. I have others, but my problem was I had to pack them up and bring them across the campus, so I couldn't bring any big stuff. So I brought a little piece. But you can see very clearly on this little piece that I'm going to send around that these organisms called trilobites, because they divided into 3 lobes, longitudinal lobes, you can see, they become extremely abundant. And we know that there were a huge diversity of these trilobites that evolved. Many of them have really very interesting structures that you find along them. They have very ornate features on them. And one of the most fascinating things is that they already, 545 million years ago, they have compound eyes. Their eyes are also preserved because the lenses of the eyes comprise of calcite. And so we can see these beautiful structures preserved. There are other interesting organisms like these hallucigenia that have these protuberances on the dorsal part as well as on the ventral part of their bodies. Really unusual structures. And we see many of these examples that are really quite astounding, and the diversity is really interesting. And there have been many people who've tried to understand why did this explosion of diversity occur. It seems there may have been an increase in oxygen availability at the time, but it also looks like there may have been this developmental genes that were beginning to change at that time. So very small changes in these homeotic genes could have led to big changes in body form. And maybe this explains why there was this huge explosion of body forms at this time. So we see all those different relatives of modern animals beginning to evolve around about this time. The first vertebrate, that is animals with an internal body skeleton, we see in the fossil record about 530 million years ago. And from then onwards, we see this big diversity of life on Earth. So what this chart shows is that over time, from about 3.5 billion years, we can see these microorganisms in the fossil record. We can see the increasing development of complexity. But what this chart is showing you is just when we begin to see the origins in the fossil record. And for me, one of the most fascinating things to understand is how these organisms are all related. And in this lecture, I don't have time to tell you about these things, but certainly we know that, if you look, for example, at the vertebrates, we have a really good understanding of how all modern vertebrates are related. So they, really interesting research about each of these groups. So the radiation of plants, or the radiation of insects, or the radiation of invertebrates. Really, a huge amount of research goes into these. And this chart is just showing you this idea about when these forms. In fact, people, my book about fossils for Africa does some of that in terms of how these organisms are related to one another. So, if we go back to our 6 points, we know that from science, we know that the age of the Earth is old. We know that the fossil record tells us there have been changes from simple to more complex life forms. So what about this idea that organisms that are closely related share characteristics in terms of their morphology, in terms of their physiology, and in terms of their genetics? If we look at this cladogram, which shows us the relationship of these animals, we see that all these are vertebrates, And we know that among the vertebrates, this group here, all highlighted in green, are called tetrapods because they have 4 limbs. And we see 4 limbs evolved at that point. So the shared characteristic of 4 limbs, all organisms that have 4 limbs, is this homology of having the limb. And if you think about this, whether you're looking at an amphibian, whether you're looking at a crocodile, whether you're looking at a bird or a human, the same bones that make up the arm of the crocodile make up the arm of the mouse and make up our arm. Okay, it's exactly the same bone. So we have the humerus, radius, ulna, and of course the carpals and metacarpals. It's exactly the same bone. So it's the same features. Even if you look at an amphibian, if you look at the bones that are present in its forelimb, you will see the same structures. So we call these are these homologies, the homologous character that makes all of these organisms related is the fact that they all have 4 limbs. And just like that, if you look at all the vertebrates that exist on our planet, we can see that the more closely related organisms are, the more closely they share particular combination of features. So at each of these points, we see these homologies that occur. So feathers unite all birds. And milk production occurs in mammals. But the amniotic egg, this is the cladoic egg that develops in reptiles, unites all of the reptiles and the lineages that reptiles gave rise to. So reptiles also gave rise to birds, they gave rise to crocodiles, of course, and we know they are still, and also mammals. So all of these are united by this feature. And all of them, all of this group, all the tetrapods, are united by the fact that they all have this common feature of limbs. And if we go further down, we see that the development of lungs unite all of that group, the development of jaws, and the development of the vertebral column. So these innovations actually show us the relationship across all these vertebrates. And one of the interesting features is that sometimes we see that if an organism, we see organisms and we think, oh, but this organism is a whale, in this case here, a whale, and the whale doesn't have hind limbs. Why is it called a tetrapod? But if you look at a whale skeleton, and all of you can look at a whale skeleton, because at Ezeco museums, they have these wonderful whale skeletons that are mounted up on the ceiling. And if you look at the skeleton, you'll see that in the hind part, there are remnants of the limbs of the whale. So you'll see parts of the pelvic girdle and these vestigial limbs that also develop. Some people say, but snakes are tetrapods, but they don't have legs. But we know that in the development of snakes, there were legs, and some snakes, like in the python, if you do an X-ray of a python, you will see remnants of its limbs. And in the evolutionary history of snakes, there was a stage where they actually did have limbs. So we do see these structures that are kind of throwbacks of the evolutionary history of those particular species. What about humans? So we have the coccyx. I think all of you know about these. These are the fused tail vertebra. Yes. And what about these? Do you people know these? So these muscles that we have behind our ears are actually remnants of our own ancestry. So I'm not sure how many of you in this audience can actually move your pinna, the fleshy part of your ear. But in the evolutionary history of our development, like the way we see dogs and cats, they move the ears and they're able to move the pinna, those are the muscles that would move that ear. But we don't do that anymore. But we have those muscles still. So we are not perfect. Whales are not perfectly adapted for the life that they live. They have these remnants of their evolutionary history still present in their skeletons. And we have them as well. What about the genetics? I think for me, one of the most humbling things about life on Earth is that every single organism that is alive on Earth has the same genetic code. So this genetic component that makes up the DNA, these 4 bases, the adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine, they are these genetic information that actually codes our DNA, that actually allows for specific amino acids to be made. And whether you're looking at a humble fungi, or you're looking at a big tree, or you're looking at a human, the genetics, the actual same 4 bases are present in all those organisms. And of course, they all suggest common ancestry. I'm sure you're all aware that in 1999, the human genome was unraveled. And you also probably know that our closest relative is the chimpanzee, and we share 99% of our genes with the chimpanzee. Do you know we share 66% with daffodils? And between 40 and 50% with bananas. Okay, so yeah. I think the question we should all be asking is, what is that 1% that makes us different? And there's been several articles that have come out about what are these genes that make us different from chimpanzees. We know there's a whole suite that make us different from daffodils, but I think the 1% that sets us apart from chimpanzees is very, very interesting. Other things that you should also be aware of is that this globin molecule that we have in our muscles, myoglobin, and in our blood we have hemoglobin. In both places, they carry oxygen. And interestingly enough, we have molecules, globin molecules, in bacteria, in plants, in fungi. And in all those animals or organisms, they actually also function to carry oxygen. But it's the same globin molecule. And if we look at just the particular hemoglobin molecule within different species, the more closely related species are to us, the more similar the globin molecule is. And the more further away we are, like the lamprey, which is a agnathan, it's still a vertebrate, but it's more distantly related to us, so there are many more changes that we see evident in that amino acid chain that they produce. What about transitional organisms? If evolution is true, there should be transitional organisms in the fossil record. And there are a number of these intermediate organisms that are around. So we know Archaeopteryx, which is an intermediate between non-avian dinosaurs and birds. It has features that share characteristics between these 2 big groups, between the 2 big clades. We have Tiktaalik, which is an intermediate between sarcopterygian fishes and tetrapods. They have features in their skeleton that actually tells us they are in between these 2 groups. And from South Africa, we have Diathrognathus, which is a mammal-like reptile, which is a cynodont. For those of you that were attending the other lectures, they are cynodonts, the lineage that gave rise to mammals. And we see Diathrognathus is one of those intermediate cynodonts. And of course, there's this wonderful animal called Pakicetus that is an intermediate between hooved mammals and whales. And in body form, it's intermediate. And when people have done genetics, they've realized, in fact, that whales are most closely related to artiodactyls. So it's been, again, this idea that the morphology and the genetics also suggest that they're more closely related. So there are many examples of these intermediate forms. And if evolution is true, then we also expect populations to change as conditions change. And there are a number of biologists who actually are working in the field, and there have been several long-term studies that have shown that actually organisms do adapt to change. And the classic example of these finches called Geospiza, these are the same finches that Darwin worked on. And we know that when Darwin had proposed this idea about evolution as a mechanism, natural selection as a mechanism for change, he actually showed very clearly how the ancestral form of the ground finch could have changed depending on the food that was available on the different islands in Galapagos. But more recently, there's been a husband and wife team that began to look for more than 30 years. They've tracked how weather changes have affected how the birds actually look. And they've suggested that if we look at the birds, we see that if there's a drought, there are fewer smaller seeds. The ones that survive are the ones that are able to eat harder seeds. And of course, they are the ones that transfer the genes to the next generation. So the subsequent generation have larger, deeper beaks. And so we certainly do see that populations change depending on the environment to which they are adapted to, and when conditions change, they can also change. Do organisms change from one form to another? And I think the fossil record is an ideal example to look at this. We can look at the evolution of horses over a period of 57 million years, and we can see how horses have changed from being leaf eaters, from being browsers to grazers, and what kind of adaptations actually occurred. Most of the time when we look at these changes, we can link the changes in anatomy to changes in environmental conditions. And we see that in the case of horses, from Hyracotherium to modern Equus, we can see changes in the body form, changes in the skull, changes in the dentition that are all related to changes in environmental conditions over this time. And we also see that in the case of horses, we can see how the number of toes on their feet actually changed and how their posture changed as well with increasing body size. So if we look at these 6 different points, we see that for each of them, there is really good evidence to show that evolution does actually occur. So if we think about, if evolution occurs, can all these different points actually be shown? Can we illustrate that they do occur? Because if none of them occur, it means that evolution will be falsified. And there have been, just like this, many other tests that people have said, oh, if evolution is true, what about this? Can they actually be falsified? And to date, we see that more than 150 years have passed, and we still see that Darwin's idea of evolution is overwhelmingly supported by evidence. So people, evolution is not just a theory. Evolution is a scientific theory, and it is the best explanation we have for life on Earth. Okay, thank you. Yes, there's several. There's actually articles written about it, and I didn't have time. I could have gone off that, but I didn't. So basically, they mainly have to do with the brain and with the development of speech. and with physiological changes. So there's very nice articles. Is there a website? I wonder if there's a website. I can put up an article for you that has recently been done. And actually in my book, there's also, in the latter part of the book, there's aspects about changes that have occurred in humans. So yeah, but mainly to do with speech and with the brain itself. Yes?
I was a little surprised that you shouldn't refer to the 22 years that Darwin took to produce his book.
Yeah.
All the experimental work that he did on breeding pigeons.
Yeah.
Because it was, to me, very fascinating that he was doing that work, because he was trying to, I think, work out what is a species. One question you haven't given us the answer to is, what is a species? You sort of said that it's a species.
Okay, so I took it for granted, but look, basically, species would be the biological concept of species would be a group of interbreeding organisms. So that is the way in which you define species. So if a species can interbreed and produce fertile offspring, then we would say that those are particular species, even if they look very different. But the fact that they can produce fertile offspring that can reproduce themselves would be a species.
But how do the species change, if that is your criteria?
So in the fossil record, of course, we're not able to understand, whether we're dealing with reproductive groups, but we can look to see how these organisms actually change over time. So in a particular niche, over time, if we can, because the horses are so well known in the fossil record, we can see how they actually change. So it's just like if you have so many of these organisms that are so similar, you can align them and you can see what has changed from one group to the next. So it's based basically on morphology. Yeah, there's so much. I could have spent an entire lecture just talking about Darwin's voyage around the world, or Darwin's 22 years that he spent working on beetles. He did a phenomenal amount of work on beetles, worked on pigeons, on horses, on snails, barnacles. I mean, in that 22 years, he knew that he had to produce a thesis, a theory that was going to test everything, and that anyone would be able to test it and come up with their own idea that it's really something that can't be falsified. So yeah, he was very hesitant to publish it.
Could you just briefly explain homeotic gene?
It's very complicated, but do you know, people, just today I was talking to someone, and I was talking to you, and I was saying that I'd like to do, was it to you? No, somebody else, I'd like to do another summer school course next year about homeotic genes. So homeotic genes are these developmental genes. And we know that in all organisms there are these homeobox genes, and these homeobox genes are so conserved throughout evolution that even in the simplest organism, if you think about a fly, the fly has the same homeotic genes that we have. But the way in which our homeotic genes have been duplicated and the way in which they actually now function makes us the complex organisms that we are. So these developmental genes, particularly in the Cambrian, are really important, because if we change just a slight organization of those genes, it can result in different body forms. And so I've been thinking, I don't know, actually you can tell me here, do you think it would be too complex, or you think people will be interested? Because I think it would be really nice, and what I will do is, and I was thinking we could have somebody talk about homeotic genes in plants, homeotic genes in microorganisms, and looking at the development of complex forms like bats and pterosaurs. How pterosaurs came about. Remember, pterosaurs are the flying reptiles. We don't have anything about the soft tissue of the animal. But just by our understanding of homeotic genes, we can make a hypothesis of how flight developed in those animals, because how those bones actually grew the way they did, because today we understand the genetics of it. I think it'd be fascinating, and I have to think more clearly about a 5-week series of lectures and how we could actually do that. But yes, so developmental genes could be a fascinating thing.
And has this knowledge only become available since 1999 about the
homeotic? No, it's been earlier. I think there have been development of these ideas have been around for a while, but I think we are now in a better position to understand the when and how they become activated. So it's this idea about evo-devo, so evolutionary development, so how development is affected by these particular genes that are switched on and off at various times. Yes?
Is there a room in your mind for evolutionary biology and creationism to coexist?
Not creationism, because I think in my mind I see evolution as being an explanation for how the world, how life actually developed, how life actually came about. But I want to say that, you know, I don't think creationism can be explained by this, but I think that if people are religious, I think people have to understand that maybe evolution, and some people do think this, that evolution is God's way of letting organisms develop the way it's happened. I mean, we can't say, I would never say there is no God. I think, I don't know, it's a bit difficult thing to say. But I think that people need to find a comfortable space that can make religion, a place for religion and a place for evolution. And I think certainly religion has a huge amount to contribute in terms of spirituality, in terms of how one lives one's life, how you are, whether you're a Hindu, whether you're a Christian, whether you're a Buddhist. It shouldn't matter, because all these different religions talk about being good to one another. And I think that, for me, is what people need to realize is, you know, it's these fundamentalists that actually cause more problems than anything else. And I think there's a place for everyone to respect all religions that exist.
Just a comment on that. One of the workers that you mentioned, Mendel, 1865, was a Catholic monk.
Yeah.
And he didn't get excommunicated. My question is, do we know which were the first warm-blooded creatures?
Ooh, that's a big question. Because, and that is an area that I'm particularly interested in, so I could keep you here for a couple of minutes.
So the jury's still out on that?
The jury's still out on that, because we don't actually know. You must remember, warm-bloodedness or endothermy is not preserved in the fossil record. Okay? But what we do have is suggestions of how animals actually grew. And so from their bone structure, so we know among modern animals, the only endotherms are mammals and birds. Okay? And we know that mammals and birds, if you remember the vertebrate chart, mammals and birds develop from reptiles. And reptiles, of course, are cold-blooded, the ectotherms. And so, where along the trajectory from the mammalian ancestors, like the cyanodonts, the mammal-like reptiles, where this change actually occurs is very, very debated. And in fact, in my Forerunners of Mammals book, we have a chapter. One of the last chapters, I managed to get a physiologist and a paleontologist write about the development of endothermy, because what we have is the bone structures and these inferences that could lead to high ventilation rates or postures that suggest that animals probably had high ventilation, but we don't have the soft tissue where we can actually say these are animals that have high mitochondrial content that would have been able to sustain aerobic capacities. So we don't have that. And the same with the birds. When we look at the evolution of birds, we know that birds derive from dinosaurs. And the early dinosaurs, we think, were basically reptilian in physiology. But somewhere along that trajectory from dinosaurs to birds, endothermy evolved. And my hypothesis is that it occurred actually on the lineage of birds themselves. Because when we look at birds, we know there are many different kinds of birds. And in the Mesozoic, there were a range of birds that developed. And among those birds, only the group that we call the Ornithuri actually show in their bone structures features that are like modern birds today, which suggests that they grew very rapidly and very quickly. So it's an interesting question, but one that we can't pinpoint, but one that we can make some inferences and hypotheses, exactly the scientific word, the hypotheses about how this could possibly have occurred.
One up there.
Sorry, which one?
At the back, the lady with the number.
Yes.
Hi, sorry. How is it that if natural selection chooses those characteristics that best support survival, how is it that Neanderthals are extinct and, say, elephants are still around?
So, of course, in every environment, we know that, as we've seen, that organisms can change according to the environment. And Neanderthals might be extinct, but we know that Neanderthals live on in us. Because we know the most recent research on modern humans suggests that, of course, modern humans and the DNA from the Neanderthals that have been examined suggest that there is a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA still in us today. So, in fact, Neanderthals didn't go extinct. The contribution of contemporary animals at the time, so Neanderthal would have contributed DNA to a new kind of human that existed, and that human then became better adapted than Neanderthal to that environment. And so elephants, of course, we've seen elephants change so much over time. I mean, I have a student who's doing a PhD on elephants. And in different parts of the world, there were different kinds of elephants. I mean, the research that my student is doing is on dwarf elephants from the Mediterranean. I mean, because they were growing on small islands, they actually didn't need to grow bigger than this. We have full-scale elephants that size. You know, and you see all the features and the morphology of a modern elephant, you will see it in that animal. But that also brings this other question about pedomorphism and, you know, organisms that these dwarf elephants, they look like juveniles of the large one, but they actually become sexually mature at a younger age. Can I ask? Oh, sorry. Sorry, I have to defer to you.
Do you think global warming will produce a sudden acceleration of evolution? You see a whole new path taken in evolution, especially amongst microorganisms.
Well, I don't know about producing, but I think certainly, if for those of you that are attending our extinctions course, I mean, I have a course on extinctions currently running, and we've been talking particularly about how these different crises actually stimulate different organisms to become better adapted. And, you know, so global warming is affecting biota on such a big scale. But what we also know is that there are some organisms that are thriving under global warming. So there are some organisms that are better adapted to the increase in temperatures, and those are the ones that were going to survive. If you're reading, one of the recommended books in our extinctions course is Elizabeth Kohler's book called The Sixth Extinction. And in that book, she looks at, she talks to scientists who are doing research in the Amazon, and they're looking at which are the plants that are being adapted better to the changed environments. So it really depends. I don't know about new species, but certainly there may be ones that become better adapted to the changing world. Yes?
Thinking back at 3.5 billion years, evidence is that carbon there, so there must be life there. I want to go off on a tangent, and that's a little bit to do with your story. Can you answer just a yes or a no? Don't go into your explanation. You're going to take all day. Panspermia, is that gaining acceptance again?
I think so. And I think so, but I have to tell everybody what panspermia is. Okay, because otherwise you won't know.
What's the question?
So the question was, I had to answer yes or no to whether panspermia is actually gaining traction now, yeah. And my answer is yes, because panspermia hypothesis suggests that when we look at life on Earth, we know that of all the planets in the galaxy, we know that only on Earth do we see life developing the way we have seen today. But panspermia hypothesis suggests that life could have originated in outer space and then came to Earth. And the reason I say it's gaining traction is because when we look at all the meteoritic evidence that comes from outer space, we know that on meteorites you can find amino acids that we actually find in living organisms today. So under natural conditions out in the universe, amino acids can actually form. And we know that amino acids are what makes up our DNA. So we know that it's really can be possible. But how and when, we don't know. Sorry, I couldn't just leave it at a simple yes or no.
I've always believed it, but I've had fights with biologists for a long time. I'm a geologist.
Okay, yeah, but I mean, when I look at the evidence, I must tell you, for those of you that are ever going to Australia, I was recently in Adelaide, and I haven't seen this anywhere else in the world, but I visited the Adelaide Museum of Natural History, and they had the most wonderful, I don't know if you've seen it, Vanessa, but there's a wonderful meteoritic collection. And they had this fantastic, the Murchison's meteorite, where they first found amino acids, actually on display. It was just astounding to see. It's just wonderful. So if you find yourself in Adelaide, that's where you should go and visit.
I think one more question and then we should call it quits.
DNA also evolved?
Well, DNA certainly changes, because you must remember that DNA is not static, that, you know, every one of us here are unique because our combination of DNA is different. So DNA certainly changes. And when DNA changes, you could call it evolve, but the DNA changes could actually lead to other changes. So often you will see there would be, I mean, simple things. Each of us are unique because of our unique combination of DNA. And in some cases, if sometimes you have mutations that develop, they could be deleterious. They could be ones that are not, will not allow the animal or the organism to grow to adulthood, or it might just terminate. So there are many different reasons. And often the mutations that we see, even evident in human populations, tell us that DNA actually does change.
Thank you very much, Anusha.